He left me for a thinner woman, someone who smiled lighter, moved faster, who could slip through doorways and conversations without making them smaller first, who fit into the world the way I never could, no matter how hard I tried to fold myself into something more acceptable. When he packed his things on that gray Tuesday afternoon in our Seattle apartment, he didn't look back, didn't pause, didn't give me the dignity of a final glance. I remember thinking as I watched him load boxes into his Tesla, maybe if I'd been smaller, in body, in voice, in need, he'd have found room for me in his life. But pain has a strange appetite. It eats you whole, strip by strip, day by day, then spits out someone completely unrecognizable, not just to others, but to yourself when you catch your reflection in unexpected places. For months afterward, I kept replaying the moment he walked away, like a Netflix series I couldn't stop binge-watching, except I was both the villain who drove him away and the victim left standing in the wreckage of what we called love. People told me I'd glow up, that the best revenge was looking good, that one day he'd see me and regret everything. But I didn't want revenge. I wanted something quieter, something deeper. I wanted peace that didn't depend on his regret. And when the day of the divorce finally came, when I walked into that King County courthouse with its fluorescent lights and worn linoleum floors, I was calm, quiet, rebuilt from foundations I'd laid myself, brick by painful brick. He looked at me across that sterile waiting room, eyes searching my face like someone trying to place a stranger from a half-forgotten dream. And for the first time in 7 years, he didn't know who I was. The truth is, neither did I anymore. But she, this woman I'd become through fire and silence and midnight conversations with my own reflection, didn't need his recognition anymore. She'd learned to recognize herself. That day, he signed the papers that ended our marriage with a hand that trembled slightly. I signed the ones that started my life with fingers steady as stone, feeling each letter as liberation. Because sometimes losing someone isn't the tragedy everyone says it is. Sometimes it's the permission slip you needed all along to begin again, to breathe without apologizing for the space your lungs require. We were married for 7 years, long enough to memorize the shape of silence, the way love can shrink inside a house until it's smaller than the dust particles floating through afternoon light, the way you can live with someone and still feel completely alone. At first, in those early days that now feel like someone else's memories, he was gentle. He'd hold my hand in public without hesitation, call me beautiful even when I didn't believe it, even when I'd spent the morning crying over jeans that wouldn't zip. But slowly, like seasons changing so gradually you don't notice until suddenly it's winter, compliments turned into comparisons. "You used to look different," he said one Sunday morning over coffee and bagels. "You've let yourself go a bit." He smiled like it was a joke, like concern wrapped in honey, but the words burrowed under my skin and made a home there. I started counting calories and apologies at the same time, tracking both in apps on my phone with the dedication of someone trying to earn back love. Every meal came with guilt measured in grams, every mirror with disappointment measured in inches. I tried to be smaller in every sense, softer voice in meetings, lighter step on creaky floorboards, fewer needs expressed during dinner conversations. It wasn't just my body he stopped loving, it was my confidence, my laughter, my tendency to take up space in rooms. When she appeared, when he met her, and I knew he'd met someone by the way he started showering twice a day, by the way his phone became a sacred object he carried everywhere, even to the bathroom. He said she reminded him of how I used to be. That sentence broke me more than any betrayal, any lie, any late-night argument ever could. She was thin, radiant, a yoga instructor with a lifestyle blog and green smoothies photographed in perfect light. She was full of the energy I'd buried deep underground just to survive him, just to be the wife who didn't complain, who understood, who made everything easier. In his eyes, she wasn't just new. She was everything I had failed to be, every version of me I'd tried and abandoned. every pound I couldn't lose turned into proof of my inadequacy. The day he left, moving boxes already packed, Uber waiting outside, our dog whining at my feet, he didn't cry. He said, "You'll thank me one day. I'm actually doing you a favor." As if rejection were a gift I should unwrap with gratitude, as if abandonment was an act of kindness. For a long time, I believed him. I thought healing meant becoming someone he'd want again, losing weight until I disappeared into the version of me he could love. But life had other plans. Because sometimes, the person you rebuild isn't made for his gaze. She's made for her own. The mirror in our bathroom used to be our witness, that full-length one from IKEA that he insisted we mount on the closet door. I'd stand beside him getting ready for dinners with his colleagues, pretending not to notice how his reflection seemed proud, at ease, while mine looked apologetic, like I was sorry for taking up pixels in the same frame. In photos, the ones he'd post on Instagram, carefully curated for his tech startup image, he'd wrap an arm around me, pulling me close for the picture. But he was always angled slightly forward, positioned strategically so that distance and geometry could hide his discomfort with my size. "You're just not the same," he'd say when I avoided his touch, when I pulled away from kisses that felt more like inspections. I wanted to ask, same as what? Same as when? But I already knew the answer. Same as before I stopped starving myself for approval. Same as the girl in our wedding photos who weighed 30 pounds less and smiled 30% less genuinely. I tried to become the woman he once loved. Smaller, quieter, always smiling at the right time in the right way. The kind of woman who never took up too much space, even in her own life, even in her own home, even in the bed we'd shared for years. Every morning, I'd put on makeup like armor, full coverage foundation, contouring to slim my face, the works. I'd spend 45 minutes hoping that cosmetics could hide the fear that he'd already emotionally checked out, that he was already mentally packing his bags. The mirror became my battlefield. Me against the reflection of the woman he no longer wanted. Me against every version of myself that didn't measure up to whatever impossible standard lived in his head. I kept searching for her in old photos on my phone, scrolling back through years of our relationship, wondering if love had a weight limit, if there was a number on the scale that would have made him stay. At night, I'd lie awake listening to his breathing, deep and even while mine was shallow and anxious, trying to match my rhythm to his, desperate to prove that we could still be synchronized in something, even if it was just this basic biological function. But the silence between us got louder than our hearts, louder than the white noise machine we ran to help him sleep, louder than anything we'd ever said to each other when words still mattered. And one morning, when I looked into that IKEA mirror again after he'd left for his morning run, the one he started taking right after meeting her, I realized there was no us left to reflect, only me, shrinking into the outline he left behind, trying to fit into negative space. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting matches like in the movies, no slammed doors or thrown dishes. Just a quiet decision sealed in a sigh over takeout Thai food neither of us was eating. "I think we want different things," he said, chopsticks still in hand, and I nodded like I'd been expecting the verdict all along. Like I'd been bracing for this moment since the first time he looked at me with disappointment instead of love. The suitcase was already packed, as if love had an itinerary, as if leaving required the same careful planning as one of his business trips. He avoided my eyes, pretending to check his phone, scrolling through nothing while I tried to memorize the way his hands once reached for me without hesitation, without thought, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "It's not you," he said. The oldest lie in the book, the same words 1,000 men have used to soften the blow. "I just need something new, something different." Something thin, I thought, though he never said it out loud, never had the courage to speak the truth we both knew. I asked if she made him happy. He hesitated, just for a moment, But that pause told me everything words never could. Told me that this wasn't about happiness. It was about image, about the way her body looked next to his in photos, about the compliments his friends would give him. When he walked out of our apartment for the last time, rolling his carry-on behind him like he was just going on another business trip, I didn't chase him down the hallway. I just stood there in our doorway, surrounded by silence heavy enough to have its own gravity, its own atmospheric pressure that made breathing feel like work. His smell lingered on everything. His pillow still held the shape of his head, his toothbrush still beside mine in the cup we bought together at a farmer's market 3 years ago. It was cruel. How absence can still take up so much space, how someone can leave and somehow be more present than when they were there. I went to the mirror again, that same battlefield mirror, searching for what he no longer saw, trying to understand what exactly had made me unlovable. All I found was a stranger who still blamed herself for being left, who had internalized every criticism until they became her own voice. I told myself I'd be fine, that I didn't need anyone, that I was strong and independent, and all those other things we tell ourselves when we're breaking. But the truth was simpler and sadder. I didn't know who I was without being someone's before and after comparison, someone's cautionary tale about letting yourself go. That night, I opened the fridge and stared at the leftovers from dinners we'd cooked together. Half a casserole, half a life. Everything unfinished and growing cold under that harsh refrigerator light. And as the light flickered across the kitchen floor, as my dog whined softly at my feet, I whispered the sentence that started my rebirth, that changed everything. If he couldn't stay, maybe I finally can. Stay with myself, that is. Maybe I can finally stop running from my own reflection. After he left, our apartment, that overpriced one-bedroom in Capitol Hill with the view we couldn't really afford, became unbearably loud in its quiet. The ticking clock above the stove, the hum of the refrigerator, the creaking of pipes in the walls. Every sound reminded me there was no we anymore, just me and the echo of what used to be us. I stopped turning on the lights at night, navigating by memory and the blue glow of my phone. Darkness was easier than seeing how empty everything looked without him, without the illusion that love still lived here, that we were just going through a rough patch. My friends, the ones who never really liked him anyway, who saw through his performative kindness, told me to move on, as if heartbreak had an expiration date like the yogurt in my fridge. But grief doesn't vanish on schedule. It settles into your bones and learns to whisper in your own voice, disguising itself as your own thoughts. I stopped cooking real meals. The plates stayed stacked and spotless in cabinets that suddenly seemed too big. No reason to dirty them for one person, no reason to pretend I had an appetite. Food lost taste, and I mistook numbness for discipline, depression for finally getting control of my eating. I'd scroll through photos of the two of us on Facebook, Instagram, the digital archive of our relationship. My smile rehearsed in every one. His eyes always elsewhere, always looking at something just past the camera. How had I missed that he'd been leaving long before he actually left? How had I not seen the signs written in every pixel? Nights bled into mornings in a gray blur of Netflix and wine. I'd wake up tangled in sheets that smelled like yesterday, half expecting his weight beside me, half relieved when I remembered I had the bed to myself now. Once, I found one of his t-shirts buried in the closet, that vintage Nirvana shirt he wore to look cool at parties. I pressed it to my face, hoping grief could smell like closure, that I could breathe in the past and somehow exhale it completely. It didn't work. The silence became a mirror too, one I couldn't avoid no matter how many podcasts I played, how many hours I spent on the phone with my sister. It reflected everything I'd lost, but also everything I'd never really had, all the ways our love had been performance rather than presence. And somewhere between exhaustion and surrender, between the third glass of wine and the edge of sleep, a small, defiant thought appeared in my mind like a candle in the dark. Maybe the silence wasn't punishment. Maybe it was space. Space for something new to grow, quietly, like a bruise turning into skin again, like healing happens when you stop watching it so closely. It started small, a walk around Green Lake just to feel the air, to remember what moving felt like. My legs ached after just one lap. My chest burned. But the wind off the water didn't pity me or judge me. It pushed me forward anyway, indifferent to my pain. I began walking every morning before work, before the sun fully rose, when the city was still quiet and possibility felt real. No music, no phone, no destination, just movement. I didn't know it yet, but that was my body remembering itself, remembering that it could do things beyond simply existing in space. Strangers nodded at me on the path, other early risers, dog walkers, runners with their expensive gear. And for the first time in months, I didn't look away or pretend to check my phone. I didn't feel beautiful. I felt alive, which was better, which was everything. The city looked different without his shadow next to me, without constantly checking to see if he was embarrassed to be seen with me. Softer somehow, quieter. The world didn't shrink when I walked alone. It expanded, opened up like a flower I'd never noticed before. One morning, after maybe 2 weeks of these walks, I stopped in front of a Starbucks window and caught my reflection in the glass. My hair was messy, pulled back in a hasty ponytail, my face bare of makeup, my body in old leggings and a sweatshirt. But I didn't flinch, didn't immediately catalog everything wrong with what I saw. I realized healing doesn't look graceful, doesn't look Instagram-worthy. It looks like sweat and swollen eyes from crying the night before and choosing to show up anyway, to keep moving even when standing still feels easier. I started eating breakfast again, not counting calories in MyFitnessPal, not weighing portions, just counting gratitude for the energy food gave me. Every bite tasted like permission to take up space, to have needs, to be human. The more I cared for myself, the less I wanted to be small, to disappear, to apologize. It wasn't about losing weight for revenge. It was about losing the need to disappear, about taking up exactly the amount of space my body required without shame. That spark, that fragile, trembling thing inside me that I thought he'd extinguished, grew quietly like moss on the north side of a tree. Not pride, not revenge, just peace, just the simple fact of continuing to exist. And one morning, standing by the lake watching the sun turn the water gold, I whispered to my reflection in the ripples, "He didn't break me." He freed the part of me that forgot her own strength, that forgot she could exist without his approval. Healing, I discovered through therapy sessions I finally started attending, wasn't about learning new things. It was about unlearning everything I'd accepted as love. The silence I'd learned to tolerate, the criticism I'd learned to internalize, the way I'd learned to flinch whenever I laughed too loud in public spaces. I realized, sitting in my therapist's office with its soothing gray walls and box of tissues always within reach, that I'd been trained like Pavlov's dog to apologize for existing, for taking seconds at dinner, for wearing clothes that showed my body, for taking up space both physically and emotionally, for having opinions that differed from his. I stopped saying sorry for things that didn't need forgiveness, for being 5 minutes late, for wanting to watch a different show, for existing in a body that didn't match his preferences. The world didn't collapse when I stopped apologizing. It just got quieter, kinder, more spacious. Some days I still missed him, missed the idea of us, but it wasn't love. It was habit. It was fear of the unknown. I missed the version of me who believed that being chosen was proof of worth, who thought that his love validated my existence. I stopped measuring progress in pounds on the scale and started measuring it in peace, in calmness, in the space between thoughts. In how many mornings I could wake up without thinking of him first, without immediately checking to see if he'd looked at my Instagram stories. I unfollowed people who sold perfection as redemption, who promised that if I just bought their program, did their cleanse, followed their routine, I could win him back. I was done chasing a body that could bring him back. I wanted a body that could carry me forward into whatever came next. The hardest part wasn't forgetting him. It was forgiving myself for staying so long in a place that starved me of joy, that made me smaller in every sense. For ignoring my friend's concerns, for making excuses, for believing his lies that it would get better. Forgiveness didn't come like lightning, like a revelation in a movie. It arrived like rain in Seattle, slow, consistent, gentle, washing the dust off my reflection, clearing the air little by little. And as I watched that old version of me fade away, the one who measured her worth by his attention, who starved herself for scraps of affection, I didn't feel grief. I felt relief, like setting down something heavy I'd been carrying for miles. Because unlearning isn't erasure, it's evolution. It's becoming more yourself, not less. One afternoon in early spring, walking through Pike Place Market, I noticed the sky looked different, bluer somehow, clearer. Maybe it had always been that way, and I was just finally looking up instead of down at my feet, finally seeing the world outside my pain. I bought flowers for no reason from one of the flower vendors, bright sunflowers that reminded me of Kansas, where I grew up. Their scent filled the apartment for days, chasing out the air of loss that had settled like dust. Even wilted petals on my coffee table felt more alive than I had in months. Music started sounding like music again instead of just noise filling silence. I danced alone in the kitchen to Lizzo, offbeat and barefoot, realizing that rhythm doesn't ask for permission, doesn't require an audience, doesn't need validation. I repainted the living room, not because it needed it, but because I did, because I wanted to erase every trace of his aesthetic choices. The color returned to the walls the same week it returned to my cheeks, my perspective, my life. Friends I hadn't seen in months started saying, "You look different," with that tone of voice that means they're trying to figure out what changed. I'd smile, knowing they meant I looked lighter, not in weight, though that had shifted too, but in sorrow, in the burden I'd been carrying. My laughter no longer felt borrowed or performed or strategic. It belonged to me again. Full, loud, unapologetic, the kind of laugh that makes other people in coffee shops turn and smile. I caught myself humming in the grocery store, twirling my hair while reading ingredient labels, existing without an audience, without wondering if someone was judging the contents of my cart. That kind of freedom was heavier and more meaningful than any revenge body could ever be. I stopped imagining bumping into him at Whole Foods, stopped rehearsing the perfect comeback that would make him realize his mistake. The fantasy of proving my worth to him finally lost its shine, became boring compared to the reality of actually living. Healing, I learned from my therapist and from experience, doesn't make you invincible or impervious to pain. It makes you gentle, with yourself, with what broke you, with what tried to stay when it should have left. And the more I softened into myself, accepted my humanity, the stronger I became in ways that had nothing to do with endurance and everything to do with presence. The morning of the divorce, I woke before my alarm, before sunrise, before the city started its daily noise. My hands were steady as I made coffee. Strange considering they used to shake just typing his name into my phone. I didn't pick an outfit for revenge or to make him regret leaving. I picked one for rebirth, for becoming. A simple dress, dark blue like deep water, the color of quiet strength and depths unexplored. When I walked into the King County Courthouse, through those heavy doors and metal detectors, people stared, but not because I looked dramatically different. They stared because I finally looked present, looked real, looked like someone fully inhabiting her own body instead of apologizing for it. He was already there, sitting on one of those uncomfortable plastic chairs in the waiting area, scrolling through his phone like this was just another errand between meetings, like ending a 7-year marriage was no more significant than picking up dry cleaning. When he finally looked up, probably sensing someone watching him. Confusion crossed his face like a cloud. His mouth parted slightly. His scrolling thumb stopped mid-swipe. The kind of look you give a stranger you swear you've met before but can't quite place, can't quite remember from which context or timeline. I nodded politely, not as a memory or a regret, but as a conclusion, as a full stop at the end of a long sentence. There was no hatred left to hold on to, only clarity, only the simple truth that we were wrong for each other, and that was okay. The lawyer asked routine questions. Papers shuffled like autumn leaves. Pens clicked in the too-quiet room. But the real ceremony wasn't the signing or the judge's declaration. It was the silence that followed, the space where our marriage used to be, now just empty air. He tried to catch my eyes across the table, tried to make some kind of connection. "You look different," he said, and his voice held something I couldn't quite name. Surprise, maybe, or loss. I smiled softly, genuinely. "I am different. I'm myself." The judge declared the marriage dissolved with the bored efficiency of someone who does this 20 times a day. I didn't feel broken or shattered. I felt released, like I had been underwater for years holding my breath and finally remembered how to surface, how to breathe. And as I walked out through those heavy courthouse doors into Seattle drizzle that felt like baptism, I didn't look back over my shoulder, didn't give him one last glance. Because when you finally recognize yourself, there's nothing left to prove to anyone else. That night, back in my apartment that was finally just mine, I stood before the mirror again. That same IKEA mirror that had witnessed so much shame, so many tears, so many mornings of trying to make myself acceptable. The light was softer now, almost forgiving, or maybe I was just seeing it differently. I expected to see the same flaws my ex had pointed out, the same body he'd found lacking, the same reminders of being not enough to keep him. But the reflection had changed, or maybe finally, my gaze had evolved beyond his perspective. My skin still carried stretch marks that told stories my mouth never did. My eyes still held small lines of exhaustion from years of emotional labor. But now, every mark looked less like imperfection and more like evidence. I lived through something that tried to erase me. I survived. I touched my own shoulder gently, as if greeting a long-lost friend I'd abandoned years ago, someone I needed to apologize to. "You're still here," I whispered to her, to me, to us. "You made it through. You didn't disappear." For 7 years, I'd stared into that mirror, searching for the woman he wanted. Smaller, quieter, more contained, more acceptable. Tonight, I found the woman I needed all along, the one who'd been buried under his expectations. She didn't smile out of vanity or performance. She smiled out of survival, out of the quiet power of knowing she'd rebuilt herself from the inside out, brick by brick, thought by thought, day by day. I took a deep breath and turned off the light, walked to my bedroom in darkness. The reflection faded from the glass, but the feeling didn't fade from my chest. It stayed, warm and solid and real. Healing, I understood finally, doesn't make you new. It makes you whole, makes you integrated, makes you stop fighting yourself. I lay in bed feeling the calm that follows storms, the silence that means peace instead of absence, completeness instead of waiting. And before sleep came, one final thought crossed my mind like a shooting star. He may not recognize me anymore, but I finally, completely do. And that's the only recognition that ever really mattered. The next morning felt like every other morning and completely different simultaneously. The apartment felt spacious instead of empty. His absence no longer echoed off the walls. It rested quietly in corners like furniture I'd grown accustomed to, harmless now, just part of the landscape. I made coffee the way I actually liked it, strong, dark, with real cream instead of the almond milk he preferred. No more half sugar, half compromise. The small rituals of solitude began to feel less like loneliness and more like prayers, like sacred acts of self-care. I thought I'd feel desperately lonely after signing those papers, after making it legally official. Instead, I felt neutral. Not happy, not sad, just present. Peace doesn't arrive with trumpets and fanfare. It just replaces the noise you used to mistake for love, fills the space chaos left behind. People called to check on me. My mom, my sister, friends from work. "How are you holding up?" they asked carefully, like I might shatter if they spoke too loudly. I told them the truth without flinching. Lighter. I feel lighter. I didn't mean thinner, though people always assumed that's what I meant. I meant freer, from waiting for texts that never came, from shrinking to fit conversations that never held me, from performing emotions I didn't feel to keep peace I never had. The photos on the walls stayed where they were. I didn't take them down in some dramatic purge. Their meaning had simply changed. I no longer looked at them for what was missing, only for what survived, for evidence of the journey. I learned that closure isn't a door slamming dramatically, isn't a final conversation where everything gets resolved. It's simply stopping the need to knock, to seek entry to a place you no longer want to be. Some nights I still dreamed of him, but even in dreams he was fading, becoming less specific, more symbolic. Like a name you forget on purpose, like a song you can't quite remember the words to anymore. The version of me that used to beg for love, that measured her worth by his attention, was gone too. And in her place stood someone quiet, steady, unafraid of silence or solitude. Someone who no longer needed to be seen by him to feel real, to feel valuable, to feel like she mattered in this world. Months later, freedom stopped feeling new or remarkable. It became ordinary in the best possible way. Part of my mornings like coffee, folded between laundry and sunlight streaming through cleaned windows. I stopped narrating my healing journey to anyone who would listen. Not every transformation needs witnesses or Instagram captions. Some are meant to be lived in private, like blooming in the dark where only you know the flower exists. I began traveling alone. First just weekend trips to Portland, then to California, then cross-country to visit friends I'd neglected during my marriage. Not to find myself like some cliché, I'd already done that work, but to meet the world as someone whole, as someone who wasn't recovering but simply living. I discovered that peace doesn't mean absence of pain. It means knowing pain can visit like weather without setting up permanent residence, that sadness can pass through without leaving forwarding address. Sometimes I'd see couples holding hands in coffee shops or walking their dogs together, and I'd feel a pang. Not of envy exactly, but of tenderness. Because love wasn't the villain of my story. I just gave mine to the wrong person for too long, invested it in someone who couldn't appreciate the value. The clothes that once hid me, that served as camouflage and protection, now felt like celebration. Not a transformation for him to see or regret, but for me to inhabit, to live fully inside my own skin. My body wasn't revenge or statement. It was home again. Imperfect, resilient, carrying me through days and years, asking only for kindness in return. I stopped waiting for an ending that proved anything to anyone. I had already written my own conclusion, my own story, and it didn't require his validation or understanding. The divorce papers were filed, our names legally separated, all promises expired like old coupons. But what stayed was freedom, soft, patient, unshakable as mountains. And when I walked past mirrors now, I didn't look away or search for flaws. Because what I saw wasn't just a reflection. It was evidence of survival, of transformation, of coming home to myself. There were things I could only learn in the fire, truths that don't reveal themselves in comfort or happiness, but only in sustained pain, in those 3 a.m. moments where you think you won't survive, but dawn comes anyway. I learned that love shouldn't hurt constantly, that relationships can have hard days, difficult conversations, moments of friction, But they shouldn't be a chronic wound you learn to ignore, like a toothache you've grown accustomed to. I learned that when someone truly loves you, they don't make you feel like you have to earn it daily. Don't turn you into a self-improvement project. Don't compare you to past versions of yourself or to other women like you're competing in some contest you didn't enter. I learned that apologizing for existing, for taking up space, for having needs, for expressing desires, isn't humility or consideration. It's self-destruction wearing the costume of love. It's making yourself smaller, thinking that's the same as making someone else happy. I learned that the loneliness that hurts less than companionship isn't loneliness at all. It's peace. And that being alone isn't a punishment or a failure, but sometimes the only way to hear your own voice above all the noise. I learned that I had been complicit in my own suffering, that every time I silenced myself when I should have spoken, every time I accepted the unacceptable, every time I made excuses for his cruelty, I was digging the grave I'd eventually have to climb out of. I learned that forgiving him was easier than forgiving myself for the years I spent betraying my own needs, for listening to his voice louder than my body screaming at me to leave. I learned that self-love isn't a destination you reach after reading 10 self-help books and doing a meditation retreat. It's a practice, sometimes minute by minute, of choosing yourself even when habit pulls you toward self-betrayal. I learned that people don't change because you love them hard enough, suffer enough, sacrifice enough. They change when they decide to, and sometimes they simply never do, and that's not your failure. I learned that letting go doesn't mean it didn't matter, didn't hurt, wasn't real. It means it mattered so much that holding on was slowly killing you, and you chose life instead. I wrote letters I never sent, never even considered sending. Pages and pages in a journal I kept hidden in my nightstand, filled with everything I swallowed during our marriage, every word I choked on, every truth I buried to keep the peace that was never really peace at all. In one letter, I asked, "When did you decide my body was more important than my soul? At what exact moment did I stop being a person and become a project that disappointed you with its failure to complete?" In another, I confessed, "You made me believe that love was endurance, that if it wasn't hard, it wasn't real. I confused your control with care, your surveillance with concern, your abandonment with some twisted form of tough love that would make me better." I wrote about every time you compared me to other women, the barista at our regular coffee shop, actresses in movies we watched, girls from your gym who posted their abs on Instagram, about how you made my worth relative, conditional, dependent on how well I measured up to strangers. I wrote about dinners where I ordered salads while you ate burgers and fries, where I counted every calorie while you counted the ways I was failing, where I tried to disappear at the table in our own home. But the letter I struggled with most, the one that took weeks to write, wasn't addressed to you. It was for me. For the woman who accepted so little for so long, who mistook crumbs for a feast, who believed your lies because the truth was too painful to face. "Dear past me," I wrote with tears blurring the ink on the page. "I'm sorry I didn't defend you. I'm sorry I believed his words instead of your instincts. I'm sorry it took me so long to hear you screaming underneath all that forced politeness." I wrote about every time I looked at myself with hatred, every time I pinched my flesh with disgust, every time I wished to be anyone else, anywhere else. I apologized to my body for treating it like an enemy when it was always the most faithful home I'd ever have. I kept all these letters in a box I bought at a vintage store in Fremont. Nothing special, just wood and brass hinges. I didn't burn them in some dramatic ritual of letting go. I kept them because they're part of my story, because even pain deserves to be archived. And sometimes, when I can't sleep, or when nostalgia tries to rewrite history with softer edges, I reread them. Not to reopen wounds, but to remember the distance I've traveled, to thank that broken woman for having the courage to start healing. It happened on a Saturday afternoon at Trader Joe's, 6 months after the divorce was finalized. I was comparing prices on almond butter, completely absorbed in the mundane decision when I heard his laugh, that specific sound I'd memorized over 7 years that once made me feel chosen and special. I looked up and there they were, 3 aisles over by the frozen section. She was exactly like her Instagram suggested, effortlessly beautiful in athleisure, her cart full of organic produce and green juice, her hand resting casually on the cart he was pushing. My first instinct was to flee, to abandon my shopping and escape through the nearest exit, to avoid this moment I'd both dreaded and secretly wanted. My heart accelerated, my hands started trembling. But something made me stay. Not courage exactly, just curiosity about what I would actually feel. It turned out I felt less than I'd imagined. Not the knife in the chest pain I'd rehearsed in my mind for months. More like watching a movie I used to love, but that doesn't move me anymore, that I can appreciate from a distance without being consumed by it. He saw me. Our eyes met across the pasta sauce display. I watched panic flash across his face, that split-second calculation of whether to pretend he didn't see me or to acknowledge the awkwardness. She didn't notice at first, too focused on reading the ingredients on a package of vegan cookies. He approached alone, leaving her with the cart. "Hey," he said in that uncomfortable voice of someone who doesn't know if they should apologize or act casual, like we were old acquaintances running into each other randomly. "Hi," I responded, and I was surprised by how steady my voice sounded, how present I felt in my body. "How are you?" The question felt both too big and too small for everything that had passed between us. "Good. Yeah, good." He shifted his weight, looked anywhere but directly at me. "You look different. Really different." I smiled, not to hurt him or prove anything, but because it was genuinely a little funny. I am different. Turns out I like who I am when I'm not trying to be someone I'm not. There was a pause heavy with everything we'd never said to each other, with all the therapy sessions and journal entries and late-night conversations with friends. He seemed to want to say something meaningful, to offer some kind of closure or explanation. "I hope you're happy," he finally said, and there was something almost genuine in his voice beneath the discomfort. "I am," I told him, and meant it completely. "I really am." I didn't elaborate, didn't give him the satisfaction of explaining my journey or detailing my transformation. This wasn't his story anymore. He nodded, glanced back at her waiting by the frozen food. "That's good. That's really good." "Take care," I said, and it was both a dismissal and a genuine wish. Then I turned back to my almond butter comparison like he was just another stranger I'd exchanged pleasantries with. When I got home and unpacked my groceries, including items I used to avoid buying around him, like full-fat ice cream and real butter and sourdough bread, I realized something profound. I'd seen them together and survived, more than survived. I'd continued living my life without it derailing me. I didn't survive alone, even though many nights I felt completely isolated in my pain. There were hands that caught me when I was falling, voices that reminded me of my name when I'd forgotten who I was beneath all that grief. Sarah, my college roommate who I'd grown distant from during my marriage, showed up at my door the night after he left with Thai takeout and tequila. She didn't say, "I told you so," even though she'd warned me about him years ago. She just said, "I'm here," and stayed until sunrise. My sister Emily, who I'd fought with so many times over my ex, called me every single day for 3 months. Not to give advice or fix me, but just to ask basics. "Did you eat today? Did you get out of bed? Did you remember to take your medication?" Even my neighbor Mrs. Chen, who I barely knew beyond hallway hellos, knocked on my door one evening with a container of homemade dumplings. "So you don't have to cook alone," she said. In that simple gesture, I understood that kindness exists in unexpected places. It was these women, each with their own scars, their own survival stories, who taught me that asking for help isn't weakness, but the first act of self-love. that vulnerability isn't failure, but the foundation of real strength. For years in my marriage, I'd trained myself to give endlessly, to be the strong one, the understanding one, the one who never needed anything. Receiving help felt like admitting defeat, like showing weakness to people who might use it against me. But I learned there's a different kind of strength in being vulnerable, in saying, I'm not okay, without drama, but with honesty, in allowing people to care for you when your own reserves are completely empty. I learned that real friendships aren't measured in the laughs you share during good times, but in who shows up when you have nothing to offer but tears and silence, when you're not fun or interesting, just broken. Sarah taught me that healing isn't linear. Some days you'll wake up feeling invincible, she told me over coffee one morning, and other days you'll cry because you found his old toothbrush under the sink. Both days are valid. Both are part of the process. And she was right. There were days I felt powerful, convinced I was completely over him, followed by Fridays where I missed him with an intensity that brought me to my knees. And that was okay. It was all part of walking forward, even when the path curved backwards sometimes. 1 year after the divorce, I woke up and didn't immediately remember the date. Not because I'd forced myself to forget, but because it had simply stopped being the center of my emotional calendar, the marker around which everything else revolved. My apartment, I'd stopped thinking of it as our apartment months ago, felt completely different. I'd redecorated gradually, not with anger or vengeance, but when budget and energy aligned. New art from local artists, plants I chose because I liked them, furniture that was mine alone. My body had changed, but not in the ways I'd imagined or planned. I hadn't lost dramatic weight or transformed into some revenge body fantasy. I'd just made peace with existing, stopped waging war against my own flesh. Some days I ate salads because I craved them. Other days I ate pizza without shame. I'd started taking pottery classes on Thursday evenings at a community center near Green Lake. My hands, which for years had only served to clean up his messes and hide my body, now created things. Imperfect bowls and lopsided vases that I loved precisely because they were flawed and honest. I'd learned something about imperfection that year. It's the only real proof that something was made by human hands, with actual effort and presence. Perfection is cold, distant, achievable only through lies and filters. Imperfection is warm, is real, is mine. My friends noticed the gradual shift. I'd stopped talking about him in every conversation, stopped measuring my progress by how much I'd healed from what he'd done. I was just living, messy and ordinary and beautiful in its simplicity. I'd gone back to school, taking night classes at Seattle Central College toward a degree in art history I'd abandoned for him. Sitting in those classrooms with students a decade younger, I felt both ancient and newborn, old enough to know what I'd lost and young enough to start again. I met new people who knew nothing about my marriage, my divorce, my weight journey. To them, I was just Julia, the woman who laughed too loud at inappropriate jokes, who brought homemade cookies to class, who always had strong opinions about Renaissance paintings. My niece told me something during a family dinner that broke my heart and healed it simultaneously. Aunt Julia, you smile with your whole face now. I didn't understand what she meant until I saw recent photos and realized, before, I'd only smiled with my mouth performatively. Now I smiled completely, unguarded. There were still hard days. Days when loneliness felt heavy, when I saw couples at movies and felt a pang of something like envy. But I'd learned not to judge those days as setbacks. They were just weather passing through, clouds that didn't change the fundamental sky. I met David 8 months after the divorce, at a pottery class I almost didn't attend because I was tired and it was raining. He was kind in that effortless way that suggests it's not a performance, that doesn't require an audience or reward. When my bowl collapsed on the wheel for the 3rd time and I almost cried from frustration, he didn't laugh or try to fix it for me. He just said, "Yeah, clay has opinions. Sometimes you have to negotiate." Something about that simple statement made me feel seen, At first, I kept him at arm's length. Not because I wasn't interested, I was surprisingly intensely, but because I was terrified. Every time I started to like him, my brain screamed warnings. What if he's like the last one? What if you lose yourself again? What if your body eventually disappoints him too? Our first real date, if you could call getting coffee after class a date, lasted 4 hours. We talked about everything except my divorce, about art and childhood, and the strangeness of being human. When I finally mentioned I was recently divorced, I watched his face carefully for judgment or pity. Instead, he said something that changed how I saw my whole story. It sounds like you survived something really difficult, and you're here anyway, trying again. That's brave. He didn't try to save me or become my hero. He just acknowledged my strength. Dating David was completely different from anything I'd known. I could eat normally in front of him without counting calories mentally. I could laugh without modulating volume. I could disagree about movies without fearing it would end in coldness or criticism. But fear lived in my chest like a permanent tenant. Every time he didn't text back immediately, I assumed he'd lost interest. Every time he canceled plans, usually for legitimate reasons like work emergencies, I braced for abandonment. One night, after I'd spiraled into anxiety because he'd been quiet for a few hours, I confessed through tears. I'm scared you'll wake up one day and realize you could do better, that I'm too much, too big, too broken, too needy. He looked at me with such gentle clarity it almost hurt. I don't want better. I want this. You. The real version, not some curated version you think I need. I didn't believe him immediately. Trust doesn't heal with pretty words. But every small action, every kept promise, every respected boundary, every time he chose patience over frustration, slowly rebuilt something I thought my ex had destroyed forever. 2 years after the divorce, I sat on my apartment balcony with coffee and the journal I'd kept through the darkest months. I read it front to back in one sitting, watching the sunrise, feeling like I was reading someone else's story. I recognized that woman. Her pain was my pain, but I wasn't her anymore. There was distance between who wrote those desperate pages and who read them now, and that distance was sacred, was earned, was everything. My body had settled into a shape that felt like home. I'd gained some weight back after losing it in grief, lost some in the process of learning to move again. But mostly I'd stopped tracking it obsessively, stopped measuring my worth in pounds and inches. My career had flourished in unexpected ways. Without the emotional energy drain of a toxic marriage, I had bandwidth for creativity, for risk-taking, for saying yes to projects that scared me. I'd gotten promoted, started freelancing on the side, built something that was mine alone. My relationship with David had grown slowly, carefully, without rush. We didn't live together yet. I needed my space, my fortress, my home that was completely mine. But there was trust, there was ease, there was laughter that didn't feel performed. I saw my ex one last time at a mutual friend's wedding. 2 full years after the divorce, 18 months since that Trader Joe's encounter. He was alone this time. Apparently the thin woman hadn't been the solution after all. He approached me during the cocktail hour, liquid courage making him bolder than usual. Can we talk for a minute? His voice held something I'd never heard from him before. Humility, maybe even regret. We stepped onto the venue's terrace overlooking Elliott Bay. The summer air was perfect, warm without being heavy. I waited for him to speak, no longer feeling the need to fill uncomfortable silences. I've wanted to apologize, he started, and for once he looked directly at me instead of past me. For how I treated you, for making you feel like you weren't enough, for not seeing what I had until it was gone. I'd fantasized about this moment for months after he left, rehearsed my response, imagined the satisfaction of his regret. But standing there actually hearing the apology I'd once desperately wanted, I felt calm. Just calm. Thank you for saying that, I told him, and meant it genuinely. I know that wasn't easy. Can you forgive me? He asked, and his voice cracked slightly on the question. I thought about it for a real moment, not performing consideration, but actually feeling into the question. I already have, I said. Not for you, but for me, because carrying resentment was heavier than anything you ever said about my body. You look amazing, he tried, falling into old patterns of commenting on appearance. I smiled without bitterness. I feel amazing, and that's the difference. It's not about how I look. It's about how I feel in my own skin, in my own life. That's what changed. It took losing everything to learn what love actually means. For years, I thought love was sacrifice without limit, that if it didn't hurt constantly, it wasn't real, that drama and pain were proof of depth. I thought love meant making myself smaller so someone else could feel bigger, filing down my edges until I was smooth and easy to hold, disappearing my needs so his could fill all the available space. I thought jealousy was passion, that possessiveness meant caring, that if he didn't check my phone or question where I'd been, he must not really love me. I confused control with concern, surveillance with devotion. I thought I had to earn love daily like wages, that my value had an exchange rate measured in pounds and appearance and performance, that if I just tried hard enough, changed enough, I could become worthy of staying. But real love, I learned this slowly, painfully, through therapy and friendships and eventually with David, is spacious, not suffocating. It gives you room to breathe, to grow, to fail, to be completely human without apology. Real love doesn't hurt chronically. It can have moments of conflict, days of frustration, conversations that challenge you. But love isn't a constant wound you learn to ignore, isn't pain you mistake for depth. Real love doesn't require you to shrink or disappear or apologize for existing. Two whole people can love each other without one consuming the other, without anyone needing to diminish themselves for someone else to shine. Real love starts with yourself. You can't find in someone else what you refuse to give yourself. Respect, tenderness, patience, forgiveness. Self-love isn't selfish. It's the foundation without which everything else crumbles. I learned that being alone isn't a failure or a punishment or something to fear. It can be a choice, a complete state of being, a valid and beautiful way to exist that doesn't need romantic love to validate it. And I learned that my worth was never ever dependent on his opinion, on his desire, on whether he wanted me. I was valuable before him, during him, and after him. His leaving didn't diminish me. It just revealed what was always there. I learned to celebrate victories that would sound trivial to anyone who hadn't lived in that particular darkness. Like spending a Friday night alone without panic, without frantically calling friends to fill the void, without feeling like solitude meant failure. Like walking into a restaurant alone and asking for a table for one without shame, without apologizing, without the server's potential pity touching me at all. The first time I did this, my hands shook ordering. By the 10th time, I brought a book and enjoyed every minute, like seeing a couple kissing on the street and feeling tender curiosity instead of that sharp pain of, why not me? Of comparing my life unfavorably to strangers whose struggles I couldn't see. Like wearing clothes I loved without an internal debate about whether they made me look bigger, whether they were flattering, whether some imaginary judge would approve. Just putting on what felt good and walking out the door. Like spending money on things I wanted, books, art supplies, a really good coffee maker, without the guilt that whispered I didn't deserve nice things, without hearing his voice saying I was irresponsible with money. The first time someone flirted with me at a coffee shop, and I smiled back without immediately panicking, without assuming it was a joke or a mistake. Not because I wanted to date them, but because I could receive the attention without it destabilizing my sense of self. The day I deleted his number from my phone, not dramatically or ceremonially, just while cleaning out my contacts during a boring Sunday. And I felt relieved, not devastated, like discarding junk mail that had taken up space too long. The night I slept in the middle of my bed, sprawled out like a starfish, taking up all the space without guilt. For years, I'd slept on my edge even when he was gone, leaving room for a ghost. The moment I realized a whole week had passed without thinking about him, without checking his social media, without wondering if he was happy or if he ever thought about me. The story had finally lost its grip on my daily consciousness. And the biggest victory, the day someone casually mentioned his name and my heart didn't race, my stomach didn't drop, my carefully constructed composure didn't crack. He'd become just a person I used to know, important once but distant now, like a childhood friend I'd outgrown. Today, 3 years after the divorce, I live in a different apartment in Ballard with a view of the water I can actually afford now. Every piece of furniture was chosen by me, for me, without compromise or committee. My mornings are mine, coffee on the balcony, journal writing if I feel like it, pottery or painting, or sometimes just sitting in silence that feels like peace instead of punishment. My body is whatever it is. Some days I feel strong and present, other days awkward and uncertain, but I'm no longer at war with it, no longer treating it like an enemy that needs to be conquered or controlled. I have friendships that feel real, substantial, based on actual connection instead of performance. People who've seen me at my worst and chose to stay, who challenge me when I'm wrong and celebrate me when I succeed. My work brings me satisfaction in ways I didn't think possible when I was just surviving, just getting through each day. I took risks, changed careers partially, followed curiosities that my ex dismissed as impractical. David and I are talking about moving in together, but slowly, carefully, making sure we're both ready. I'm not in a rush anymore. I've learned that good things don't need to be forced or hurried. I still see my therapist monthly, not because I'm broken, but because I want to maintain the health I worked so hard to build. Mental health care isn't just for crisis, it's for keeping yourself whole. I reconnected with parts of myself I'd buried during my marriage. My love of hiking that he found boring, my interest in vintage clothing he thought was weird, my tendency to talk to strangers that he found embarrassing. The divorce papers are filed away in a folder I rarely open. They're just documents now, legal proof of an ending. But what matters isn't the ending. It's what grew in the space that ending created. And when I pass mirrors now, in stores, in bathrooms, in the windows of buildings catching my reflection, I don't flinch or search for flaws. I just see myself, complete and present, and that's enough. If you're reading this and something in my story resonates, if you see yourself in my pain or my healing, I want you to know something important. You're going to survive this. Not because you're special or chosen, but because humans are absurdly, impossibly resilient when survival is the only option. You might be on the floor right now, crying so hard you can't breathe, convinced you'll never be okay again. And I can't promise you'll be okay tomorrow or next week. But I can promise that if you keep choosing life, keep choosing yourself, you'll reach a day where you realize you're not just surviving, you're actually living. The person who made you feel small, who measured your worth in pounds and performance, who taught you to apologize for existing, their opinion is not objective truth. It's just their opinion, shaped by their own damage and limitations and fears. You don't have to be thinner to be worthy of love. You don't have to be quieter to be acceptable. You don't have to shrink to make room for someone else's ego. You are allowed to take up exactly as much space as your body requires, to speak as loudly as your voice naturally carries, to have needs without shame. Healing won't look like Instagram makes you think it should. It won't be linear or aesthetic or photogenic. It'll be messy and slow and full of setbacks that feel like failures, but are actually just part of the process. You don't need their apology to heal. You don't need them to realize what they lost, to regret their choices, to come crawling back with recognition of your worth. Your healing is independent of their awareness or remorse. You don't need to forgive them if you're not ready. Forgiveness isn't a requirement for moving forward. Sometimes the best you can do is accept what happened and decide it doesn't get to control your future. You don't need to become someone new to deserve better. You just need to become more yourself, the version that existed before you learned to hide, before you started apologizing, before you confused love with pain. The love you're looking for starts here, inside you, in the daily choice to treat yourself with the kindness you give everyone else. In the small acts of self-care you think don't matter, but absolutely do. And one day, I promise you this, you'll catch your reflection unexpectedly and feel something you thought you'd lost forever: recognition. You'll see yourself, really see yourself, and think, there you are, welcome home. He left me for a thinner woman, and I spent months thinking that was a referendum on my body, my worth, my lovability. But what he actually left was his chance to grow alongside someone who could have taught him what real love means. I used to think power meant transformation so dramatic he wouldn't recognize me, meant becoming so attractive he'd regret everything. But true power is walking past your past without flinching, existing fully without needing validation from people who couldn't see you clearly. My reflection doesn't ask for permission anymore. She doesn't apologize or shrink or perform. She simply exists, takes up space, breathes deeply, and that's revolutionary in a world that taught her to disappear. The silence that once felt like punishment, those empty nights, those solo dinners, those moments without his voice filling the air, now feels like peace, like the absence of noise pollution, like finally being able to hear my own thoughts. I don't measure beauty by symmetry anymore, or love by attention span, or worth by desirability. I measure it by presence, by how gently I hold myself when no one's watching, by how kindly I speak to my reflection, by how fully I inhabit each moment. If this story touched something in you, a wound you thought was healed, a fear you're currently living, a hope you've been too scared to acknowledge, I want you to do something for me. Be kind to yourself today. Just today. Tomorrow can wait. Like this video and subscribe not for me, but for the version of yourself that still needs to hear that you're worthy. Every click is a tiny rebellion against the voices that told you to be smaller, quieter, less. Share your story in the comments if you feel brave enough, because every time someone speaks their truth, they give permission for someone else to speak theirs. We heal collectively, not just individually. Join this community of survivors, of warriors who fought invisible battles, of people who refused to disappear even when everything pushed them toward erasure. Because we, the ones who take up space, who have bodies that don't conform, who survived love that tried to destroy us, deserve to exist fully, completely, unapologetically. I stopped wanting to be the woman he regrets losing. That desire fell away like dead skin, like something I outgrew without noticing the exact moment it happened. I became instead the woman I'm grateful to have found, to have excavated from beneath years of conditioning and criticism and crushing self-doubt. There's a stillness after storms that people mistake for emptiness, but it's not empty, it's clear. It's the sound of a soul settling back into its own body after years of displacement. I don't need him to recognize me anymore. I don't need the world to either. Recognition isn't proof of worth. Existence is. Presence is. The simple act of continuing to be here, to breathe, to try. And so I live now, not smaller or angrier, but softer in some ways and stronger in others. Proof that sometimes the quietest revenge is simply peace. Proof that you can be left behind and still move forward. Proof that you can lose everything and still be whole. Proof that the person who left you doesn't get to write the ending of your story. Because this story, mine and yours and all of ours, doesn't end with who left us. It begins with who we became when we finally decided to stay with ourselves. The quietest revenge isn't making them regret leaving. It's building a life so full they become irrelevant to its joy.